are in Genesis chapter 35 today. So if you got your Bible, you'll want it. You can follow along. We're moving verse by verse through Genesis 35. Not the whole chapter, but we'll take out the first 20 or 21 verses. I want to take a moment to kind of bridge the gap from last week's message in chapter 32 to where we find ourselves today in 35. And last Sunday night, we even covered the first 7 verses of chapter 35. And I'll tell you what, this week was a week where I had 5 chapters to choose from, and I had a bunch of different messages on my heart, some of which I even thought maybe I'd go on Facebook and do a little live feed or something, because it's like, well, they were good, but nothing was great. I was having a hard time, like, Lord, you seem to always be giving me some great stuff. And I just had a hard time. And then as I was copying my notes for Sunday night, writing my little cross references in the margins of my Bible, I was starting in chapter 35, and then I just felt like, nope, Lord, that's where you want us to be. And so Jacob, in chapter 32, and I'm just going to flip back and look at it, but I'm not going to read through it all. Jacob, he gets away from Laban. He comes to meet with Esau, and we studied where he wrestled with God. In verses 22 down to the end, it's this him wrestling, and he renames him Israel. His life was changed. He never walked the same after that. And I only briefly mentioned it last week, but I really believe that this is a great Old Testament picture of the baptism of the Holy Spirit, where Jacob, a saved individual, he knew the Lord, but then after this encounter with the Lord, he never walked again the same way. He had a life-changing experience which changed the way he was as a man. But all that said, what we find in verse 30, or verses 1 and on, in chapter 33, there we go, not verse, but chapter, is that he ends up making another plan. Right after that experience, we didn't cover that last study, he goes to meet with Esau, and he comes up with yet another Jacob scheme to deal with it. And then after meeting with Esau and everything goes well, and it's a funny scenario because Esau's like, well, brother, everything was good. They hugged, they kissed, they wept. It wasn't the big battle that Jacob was fearing. And then Esau's like, we're going to head back south, down to Seir, down to the valley. You want to come? He's like, I'll be right behind you, brother. He's like, do you want me to leave any people to help you out? No, we got it covered. And so Jacob's just like, go on, Esau. And Esau's like, okay, I'll see you soon. And he goes south, and then immediately Jacob turns to the north. And he takes his whole family up north, and he settles. And then we talk about this little things we can glean. He settles and builds a house. And we talk about how he was never really called by God to build a house. Him, his father Isaac, his father Abraham, they were sojourners in the land. They were intense. They were mobile because they were just going to be pilgrims during that period. But he builds a house. And in verse 20, a verse we will be referencing as we look at chapter 35 today, so verse 20 of chapter 33, he erected an altar there and called it El Elohe Israel, which means God, the God of Israel. And so he builds this altar, and he builds it in Shechem. Now, God had called him to go to Bethel, and then he goes up to Succoth for a while, and then he comes down to Shechem, and about 10 years goes by. And he builds this altar, though, and he calls it God, the God of Israel. His God, my God's, boom. And it's a place where he worshiped the Lord. But what we end up seeing take place in chapter 34, long story short, is his daughter ends up getting raped. And then his second and third eldest sons end up slaughtering the entire city where the rapist was from. They destroy everybody. They take the women and children as slaves. And the whole time we see Jacob kind of stuttering, when there's the king of the city, and they're talking, and then the sons kind of step in. He was negotiating, talking about stuff with Jacob, and then the sons kind of step in with their plan, and you watch Jacob just kind of back off, and he doesn't really say anything. And then after his sons do all this wicked stuff, he's beside himself. He's like, everyone's going to hate us now. We are but a small nation, and we're here, the Canaanites, and they are large. You've made us stink, he says, become obnoxious, but it literally means to stink among the people of the Canaanites. And then we get to chapter 35, and I think this is something that's important, because as we lead into this, God met with him. He had this experience. He never walked the same, but the problem that Jacob had was his family wasn't quite where he was at. He had this experience with the Lord. He was worshiping the Lord. He made that altar, God, the God of Israel, my God. And he had this personal thing going on, but he realized that his family was falling apart. And that even though he got saved, even though he was empowered by God for greatness and that his life got turned around, he had many years raising up that family as a Jacob. And his kids, that's what they were raised in. That's what they saw. And so verse 1 of chapter 35, it says, "Then God said to Jacob, 'Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there and make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau, your brother.'" So here we see he's telling him to go back to Bethel. Now, way back in chapter 31, verse 13, when God originally told him to leave his uncle Laban's and come back to the promised land, he told him, "I'm the God of Bethel, come back." And so he was saying, come back to Bethel. But what he did, he left Laban, and he went up to Succoth. Then he went down and spent time in Shechem, and over 10 years passes. So we had this 10-year period of time where he still never actually made it back to Bethel where God wanted him. And here's the thing about Bethel is he's saying, go back to where you once were. Go back to where that initial experience was. Go back to where it was when we had that first encounter and things were awesome. And it reminds me of Revelation chapter 2, verse 5, where Jesus tells the church at Ephesus, "Remember therefore from where you have fallen, repent and do the first works." He's like, get back to that place. Do you remember the place it was when things were good, when things were great, when we first met and we fell in love? It's great marriage advice too, for what it's worth. It's go back to what it was like. Remember what it was like when you guys burned for one another? Go back and do the first works. Don't just think about what it was like when you were dating. Do you remember the things you did, right? Talk is cheap. Actions mean something. There's so many things I used to do when I dated Nicole that I don't do anymore. It's just when you're dating, you're excited, you want to impress them, right? So you do all these extra things. Women might take some extra time to make themselves look really nice. Guys would take the extra time to wear deodorant. It's all those, it's the above and beyond stuff. No, but it's the thing is that we try to impress and then we become familiar. And the love kind of grows cold. And he's saying, go back to Bethel. Get back to Bethel. And he also said, when I appeared to you, when you fled from the face of Esau. He takes back Jacob to when he first got saved, and he was the most vulnerable and the most dependent on God. And I think that's something that we all might struggle with, is those of us who become a believer, and then we become more spiritual, and then we become more confident in our knowledge of the Bible, then all of a sudden we start becoming confident in ourselves and our own abilities and how wise we become and how strong we become. And I think, Jacob was there at Bethel where he saw Jacob's ladder, right? The ladder or stairs ascending into heaven. And I think after some point in time, we start getting kind of super spiritual. We start climbing that ladder, working our way up. Hey, look at me go. And I think God is at the point where he wants to just knock the ladder out from under Jacob, have him come flying back down and slap his head against that rock that he used as a pillow, and kind of have a better perspective of what's going on. And look what happened in the last 2 chapters. I mean, we see his daughter, because she was hanging out with the people of the town. He allowed his daughter, it said in verse 1 of chapter 34, she started becoming friends with the people of the land. She was going out, hanging out with everyone else, and she ends up getting caught up in the wrong crowd. Then you look at his sons, and these 2 sons go off and they slaughter an entire crowd. And so he says, come back, get back. And Jacob said to his whole household and to all those who were with him, put away the foreign gods that are among you. Purify yourselves and change your garments. Let us arise and go up to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and has been with me in the way which I have gone. So they gave Jacob all their foreign gods which were in their hands, and their earrings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree which was by Shechem. He held a burial service for all these foreign gods, for the earrings and everything else. What we're looking at today is the story of Israel the man, because I will jump to the end. When we get to verse 21, it says, then Israel. You'll note, if you go back to chapter 32, where God tells him, I'm going to call you Israel from here on out, in the narrative, in the storyline, he's called Jacob, though. He's called Jacob all the way to the end of chapter 32. He's called Jacob all through chapter 33. He's called Jacob through chapter 34. And today he's called Jacob all the way up until verse 21. God had a plan. I'm going to give you a new life. You're going to be a new man. You're going to be something different. You're going to be a man of God, governed by God, led by God. And until he got his house in order with his kids and with his wife, he was still Jacob. And we find in verse 21, they finally say, then Israel, then the man we were looking for. I was looking for you to be the man I wanted you to be. And here's one of the first things he does, and this is a big step, and it's a hard step for someone to take a stand for their household and say, all right, guys, we've been doing this too long. I've been worshiping El Elohe Israel, the God of Israel. I'm having a great time getting close to God, but now I need my whole family with me. I need my whole family here. It's time to get rid of the idols. He goes out and just tells them, guys, if you've got stuff, I need you guys to be on board. I don't care how I raised you in the past. This is how we're going to be now. This is now what our family is going to stand for. And it might be different than things used to be. Oh, I know. I used to let that stuff slide, but God has shown me I've got to step it up if I want to see what God's going to do in my life. And he tells them not only to get rid of the idols, but I think it's interesting that here they give up the earrings. And it's in the whole Old Testament, you can look up that word earrings, and in many places it's a normal thing. It's spoken of as a positive thing in places, but it's not always a positive thing. Many of us are familiar with the text. And Aaron said to them, break off the golden earrings which are in your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them to me. So all the people broke off the golden earrings in their ears. They brought them to Aaron, and he received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molded calf and said, this is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt. I just think it's a gleanable lesson here that they didn't just get rid of the things they knew were bad. They knew the idols were bad. No one could argue with that. I think Jacob got to the point where he's like, you know what? If it has the potential of stumbling us, if it has the potential of bringing this family down one more time, I want it all gone. I don't just want the things that are absolutely gone from my household. I want the things that could possibly send us down that path again. I know people who have gotten rid of their TVs because to them, they knew that that would be a stumbling block. But to many of us, it's not. I know some people who choose that in their household, alcohol never comes through the door because to them, they know they could not handle a stumbling block like that in their lives. Obviously, if you are prone to stumble in an area, it's a good idea to just not even get rid of the thing, but the thing that leads to the thing. He's trying to totally consecrate his family. He's trying to totally get them where they need to be. And so he does this. They clear house. They get rid of everything. They bury it, which I love. You don't try and just subdue the flesh. It's not enough just to starve the flesh. You bury it and be done with it. Be done with the old life and the old ways. And they journeyed, verse 5. And the terror of God was upon the cities that were around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. In chapter 34, that was Jacob's fear. He was worried because his sons did all this wickedness that the towns around them were going to come back and they were going to have revenge and they were going to attack them. But Jacob sought the Lord. Jacob responded in obedience to the Lord. And God struck fear in everyone's hearts. When we decide to obey and follow in obedience to what God's called us to, God protects, God guides, God provides. He never lets us fail. He never lets us stumble. When we're just listening and going the direction he wants, he takes care of us. And it says they journeyed, right? And the fear was upon everyone else. And so Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, and he and all the people who were with him. And he built an altar there and called the place El Bethel, because there God appeared to him when he fled from the face of his brother. So here, we see something different. The first altar he built was God, the God of Israel. This is my God. And you know what? We all have to start there, right? He doesn't get to become God of your house if he's not your God. He's not, that's the first step in discipleship. I think we all are called to make disciples, but the first step of making disciples is you becoming a disciple yourself. We have to have that intimate relationship with God. We need to embrace what God has for us. Okay, now that I've done that, though, Now I need to do something more with that. And here he becomes El Bethel, the God of Bethel, or the God of the house of God, is what he titles this altar. And he decides to make a stand that now God is going to be the God of the house. It's no longer just the God of Israel, my personal God, but he is going to be the God of our house. I don't know how many of you, I could get a raise of hands, but have somewhere in your house a plaque that's got the Joshua, right? As for me and my house, we shall serve the Lord. You got it as a floor mat, maybe a cross stitch. I think we have it like in 4 different places in our house because it's a great wedding present. So you get lots of them. You know, if you're a Christian, you get married, you always get the, as for me and my house, we shall serve the Lord. You know, it's a great verse. And this is what Jacob decides. Israel, I am governed by God. I am Israel. And this is, you're the God of my house. I'm going to flip over real quick to the Shema, Deuteronomy chapter 6. I didn't even put a bookmark in there to make it fair. But it's a few books to your right if you want to follow along. But you see, this is the difference. We talked about there's El Elohe Israel, God, the God of Israel, and then there's the God of the house, the God of Bethel. This is a famous Hebrew text. It is actually a tradition that a Jewish person, a true Jewish person, would actually quote this upon their death, and they would quote it daily. This was a verse. This is really one of the most sacred pieces of Scripture to a Jewish person. Maybe you've seen a mezuzah, the little boxes they'll put up in their doorways. It has this text inside of it. My mom always would give me, I have mezuzahs coming out of my ears. My mom likes to buy me mezuzahs. And so I've got, if you want one, I've got extras. She got me a couple karzuzahs, little tiny ones that go on your car door. Well, I love my mom. She's a character. So, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. Jacob figured that out when he wrestled with God. On the mountain, he wrestles with the Lord, and that's internalized now. You are my God. I love you with my heart. I love you with my soul. I love you with my strength. You are here within me. But he failed to get the next 3 verses right off the bat. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on your doorposts, hence the mezuzah, of your house and on your gates. This is the part that he was missing. He made a stand for himself. He became a believer himself, empowered by God himself, but then he had to be the man God wanted him to be. And that's the thing, is God is looking for men, and this is going to be definitely a little man-centered message. I've got some stuff for the ladies towards the end, but it's important for all of us, for what it's worth, that God calls men to be leaders. He empowers men to be leaders. He has made men. He has formed us to lead, and there's nothing more pathetic than a man who doesn't lead. God has designed us to do that. And he was called to be the leader of his house. And he did fail for a long time. He really did. And you can see it in his kids. It plays out, sadly. He was a believer the whole time. We can be believers and never pass that on to our children. We can even have a transformational experience like in chapter 32, but never pass that on to our children if we don't take that stand to become firm that you're the God of our house. Just an example of a story. I don't want to name names, but it's hard if they were to hear it, but they're not going to listen to my message, so it's okay. Either way, the names have been removed to protect the innocent. So I've got my best friend from growing up. That narrows it down pretty quick. But interesting that his house, I don't recall them going to church. They didn't really go to church, but he would have called himself a Christian, right? I mean, we're all in America. We all call ourselves Christians, right? We believe in God. But I knew his parents were they were into it. In fact, his mom was weird. Like driving to Boy Scouts. She'd trying to get us to read daily devotionals and stuff like that. And it's just what's up with your mom? I go to church every Sunday. My mom doesn't make me do that, right? It was just kind of a weird, different thing. But they didn't go to church. I don't know what happened. Maybe got rubbed wrong at one church and something didn't go right. And so they stopped attending. And I mean, I get that. It's sometimes tough, when you have some bad church experiences, but you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But her and her husband weren't attending, and now the road goes on, and my friend now is saved. But later on, I got to talk to his mom, and I got to know her because I got saved. And all of a sudden, I'm talking to her, and I know she's a believer, and it turns out she's going to church with my parents. Same church. She goes, well, that's always been our church. We just weren't going very often. Weird. Well, it was the Calvary Fellowship on the west side, and they were going there, and so I started talking to her, and then she's like, oh, yeah, I got saved when I was this old, and she's, my mom's age, and so she'd be in her 60s now, and she's like, yep, got saved down there. Oh, she's like, yeah, at the Calvary Chapel. You got saved at Calvary Chapel? She's like, yeah, in the tent. The tent? You got to go to the tent? She's like, yeah, Chuck would teach, and we'd always come up there sitting crisscross, and Sean back then, I remember when they moved into the new building, he would go in barefoot, and it was like a big thing for a little while about people being barefoot in the pews, and I'm sitting there like, I would have given anything to have seen those days. That's like, this is a pastor whom I've been taught the entire Bible through, and I've never even got to meet the guy, and I've heard the stories of the tent and the hippies and the big movement and all the crazy stuff that was going on. I heard the stories, and most of us here probably have heard the stories of the barefoot hippies coming in, and people were getting upset because of the new pews and the new carpet, and Chuck said, rip the pews out and rip the carpet out if you're going to kick the hippies out. I'd rather keep the hippies and ditch the pews. And she's like, yeah, that was Sean. He never wore, I said a name, crap. Okay, well, either way, though, you guys don't know them. But my friends, and so I'm thinking to myself, though, today, it's like, man, they had some mountaintop times. They were a part of something that was really cool. And I know that they saw God move mightily in their lives. And they worshiped El Elohe Israel. He was their God, and they loved him. But sadly, my friends, they didn't grow up going to church. They didn't grow up with that influence. It was just interesting, and I've seen it before where such godly parents, somewhere along the line, don't pass it down to their children. And I'm talking about parents with a true, sincere love for God. Not a religious thing, not a we go to church because we go to church, but people who truly love the Lord and know him. And that's the difference here, is Jacob is now going to be the man, Israel. He is going to be governed by God. His house is going to be governed by God, and he is taking a stand. And so he builds this new altar. It is El Bethel, God, the house of God. It's the God of the house. Our household is going to serve him. And now in verse 8, it says how Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried below Bethel under the terebinth tree. So the name of it was called Elon Bahuth. Then God appeared to Jacob again when he came to Padan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, your name is not Jacob, that shall not be called your name, but Israel shall be called your name. So he called his name Israel. Verse 11, and also said to him, I am God Almighty. That's El Shaddai. First time he reveals himself as El Shaddai to Jacob. He did to Abraham, he did to Isaac, now here to Israel. I am El Shaddai. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall proceed out of you. First time he said that, the idea being those 12 sons will become like 12 little mini nations on their own. And kings shall come from your body. The land which I gave Abraham and Isaac, I give to you, and to your descendants after you, I give this. Here he is in obedience. He does what God told him to do. He came to Bethel. He set things right with his family, and God showed up in a whole new way. A whole new side of God he did not know. And so God went up from him. I don't even know what that would look like, but I'm imagining it'd be pretty cool. In the place where he talked with them, and then Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he talked with him, and a pillar of stone. He poured a drink offering on it, poured oil on it, and Jacob called the name of the place where God spoke to him Bethel, again, naming the area the house of God. And he did that before, but again, when he leaves, other people probably rename things. But then verse 16, then they journeyed from Bethel, and when there was but a little distance to go to Ephrathah, Rachel labored in childbirth, and she had hard labor. So my only guess, and this is just kind of making an assumption here, is that she probably had a premature labor. I don't think he was going to take his wife, 9 months ready to pop pregnant and go on a journey to the next town. So I'm assuming this came unexpected. There was complications. Because now it says in verse 17, it was hard labor, and now it came to pass when she was in hard labor that the midwife said to her, do not fear, you will have this son also. Earlier, when she named her son Joseph, how God adds, she actually prophesied or just made the comment, I'm going to have another child too. She didn't have Joseph until way late. She was the last one to finally have a kid. And then I'm going to have another. And the midwife is assuring her, I think, in this scenario. So I would love it if we could all just imagine what's taking place here. Side of the road, a premature labor, but the midwife saying the kid is going to make it. But that's the only assurance she's giving. Your child is going to make it out of this. And so it was, as her soul was departing, for she died, that she called his name Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, which is Bethlehem. And Jacob set a pillar on her grave, which is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. Now, I don't know for certain if this is how it played out, when you only have so many words to work with. But in my mind, I'm not imagining this as she names him Ben-Oni, she dies, then down the road Jacob just decides, I'm going to change the kid's name to Benjamin. You know, in my mind, this is now Israel, and he's with his beloved wife Rachel, who he served really 14 years to win her hand in marriage. This was the apple of his eye. This was the love of his life, and she is dying. And she's probably scared, as we all would be. And she's weak. She's afraid. She's frightened. And she says, we're going to name this kid Ben-Oni, the son of my sorrow. I get all worked up sometimes. And I just imagine him just taking his wife's hand. It's like, you know what, honey? He's not going to be called Ben-Oni. We're going to call him Benjamin. It's the son of my right hand. And I'm just imagining this beautiful picture of the husband comforting his wife, taking control of the situation. You see, that's the problem with his father and his father's father. So very often when their wives were weak, I don't think the Lord's ever going to give me a baby. Here, sleep with my maid to produce an offspring. And the husband, okay, whatever, right? And then it's like, and then there's a weak point there where I think Isaac and Rebekah were even worried about that. And then you get though to Jacob, and you have him earlier on sleeping with the maids because Rachel couldn't have kids, and he was weak back then, but now he's become a stronger man. And I'm just imagining him comforting his wife in her last moments. He's like, honey, this is not the son of your sorrow. He's the son of my right hand. And just giving her that comfort and that warmth and that thought as she passed on. And I think that's a second thing. Other than ruling the house, leading the house, taking a stand for what is right in the house, I think the husband's biggest call and a man of God's biggest call is to be there for his wife and to be there to support her and love her and to help her. And I did want to look at 1 Peter 3 because see, this is where I think something I'm gleaning as we go through Genesis. I continue to see God showing me example after example of this need for these men to step up and be the man for their wife because their wives are scared. Their wives are anxious. They're worried about what the future has in store. And Peter writes in 1 Peter 3, in verse 7, it says, husbands, likewise, dwell with them, your wives, with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. And if there was a verse for husbands to know and understand, this one would be one of them because it solves many marital problems right there. It solves spiritual problems. It solves quite a bit right there in that one little section. You'll notice that the word to wives is the whole 6 verses leading up. They only give one verse to the guys because we have short attention spans. And so he just kind of condenses it and gives us what we can handle. But here's the thing. I'll just use my wife as an example because she likes that. Because none of the other husbands could ever relate to your wife being weak. And I mean that in a moment of weakness, brokenness, being upset, being afraid, being scared of what the future may hold. And you know what? Between me and the guys, women, they get hard to work with. when they're afraid. Women get hard to work with when they're anxious and scared. They don't act like those beautiful women, spiritual women that we know them as normally. And I have to tell myself, in my wife's weakness, it's the weaker vessel. And see, here's the thing. Women, as you'll find, can even be their stumbling point, as he mentions here in the first few verses of this chapter, and as Paul talks about in 1 Timothy 2. There's all these reminding women not to worry about outward beauty, but to worry about inward beauty. But you know what? Women are outwardly very beautiful. As a man, I think that's true. And I think most of the men in here will agree with me that women are beautiful things. And have you ever noticed that the most beautiful things are always fragile? You ever notice that a painting in an art gallery, they put ropes around it? Even like for guys, right? Even like a Ferrari at a car show, they put ropes around it. You're not supposed to touch it. You're not supposed to, you don't just come up to someone's Ferrari. This is built pretty good. These Italians, you don't, no, you'd probably get punched or something. I don't know. A newborn baby is so beautiful. Most babies. I'm just saying, got to be honest, right? Can't lie. But they're fragile, right? You know, you got to wait until they're at least 6 months old before you start tossing them around a little bit. And I'm joking, but if you see me with Benny, that kid's a high-flying daredevil, so he loves to be thrown about. But the point is the most beautiful things have always seemed to be the most fragile. I like how Pastor John Corson is taught on this verse, talking about how if men were a mug, a root beer mug, big glass, what is it designed for? It's designed to hold a lot of stuff and be able to be dropped and not break. That's a guy. Whereas a woman is more like a champagne flute, which is elegant, it's beautiful, it has a very purpose design to it, and they complement each other. You need both to make a full kitchen full of drinkware. And so I'm just imagining now, finally, he's over 100 years old, but finally Israel is the man that his wife needed him to be, so that when she was weak, he was strong. When she was afraid, he was a unmovable pillar who could be there for the family. And see, it says, dwell with them in understanding. Keep this in mind when you're working with your wife, that when she is afraid, when she is scared, when she is exhibiting some of those traits that I think are just kind of God-given to her, that you must be strong and keep that in your mind. And that's going to help your marriage or any relations with women for that part. And you'll notice it says at the end there that your prayers may not be hindered. Because I do believe, too, that yes, if you're not taking care of your wife, God says, I'm going to have issues with you. And you're going to have a disconnect with me if you don't have a good connect with her. And so it's the man's job to pour into his wife and to be raising up his wife, investing in her. I heard Sandy Adams, who will be at that conference that I was just promoting earlier. He once talked about, he's like, you start complaining, he's like, I've been here for 10 years and she's no different. And he goes, oh, you've been leading her and teaching her and guiding her for 10 years and you haven't made a difference in her yet? He's like, you should probably invest some more time in her then. The guy was quiet after that. There's the point, he's like, yeah, you're supposed to be investing into her. Bill Stonebreaker, another pastor I know, he said you assign value to your possessions. If she is your wife, you need to assign value and show the value to that possession, to that thing which you love, and pour into it. Charm is deceitful and beauty is passing, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. It's that famous Proverbs 31 Mother's Day card, an anniversary card verse you need to make sure you include in there, because that's the thing, is you're pouring into her because she needs it. She needs us to be strong. She needs us to be a strong man. Now, I will say, before we move on, because I've been talking about being a man, the importance of strong male figures, the importance of rising up. I don't want to move on without at least taking a quick look at verses 1 through 6 here in 1 Peter 3, because here's the thing. When men aren't strong men, they need women who encourage men to be strong men. Wives, bear with me, people. Likewise, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they will, without a word, they may be won by the conduct of their wives. When they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear, do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair and wearing of gold and putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. For in this manner, in former times, the holy women who trusted in God also adorned themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are if you do good and are not afraid with any terror. Terror is a pretty extreme word, but in the Greek it translates differently. But just the idea of believing without fear, believing and trusting. What's the picture here? I think the big key up there is where it talks about that even if some do not obey the word, in verse 1, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives. Here's the interesting thing is that I do think our society today is really taking men and they're taking boys and they're not making them men is what's happening. Long story short, we have boys who are still boys as they leave high school and they move into their 20s and then they're in their 30s and they are still boys. There's many different ways to define manhood and childhood. And, it's funny because society calls it these other things. They call it when you're 18. They call it when you're this and that. And all this is stupid stuff. And it's like, you know what a real man does? A man knows how to delay pleasure. He knows how to work hard and wait for things. A real man knows how to wait and to work hard. And I think a big thing about being a man, and maybe even where I get this story with Israel, is a man is actually challenged to do hard things. And boys are scared of hard things. Boys are scared of hard things. If something is difficult, boys shy away. Where I think men, they look for challenges. I think that is in man. I think God put it there to conquer, to build, to construct, to grow, to run faster and jump higher, just to have that inside of them. And I think today we have many strong women. And you know what? Women are always strong. I mean, Proverbs 31 woman, we just read about her, right? She ran a whole business. She had all this stuff going on at home. She did so many things. She was a regular businesswoman. But I do think, ladies, if you got a man and you want to see him be more of a man and be more of a leader, this is the trusting in God and not being afraid with any terror. Because if you want to know there's one more terrible thing that could maybe make you afraid, it's to put your husband in charge. Truly, I mean, if he's not a manly, godly man, but to trust him, because you know what happens? He has to step up and rise to the occasion. He has to be a man when you just entrust him to be a man. It's the most scary thing to let go of control. I think that's where it says here to do good and not be afraid with any terror, because it's the idea. All right, Sarah just followed Abraham and his crazy schemes. All right, honey, you're going to be my sister. And years later, they did it again, right? But just trusting God, and then letting things work themselves out. And I think it is interesting to see how many times, and actually men who've come to know the Lord because their wives just entrusted them to lead, and even entrusted them to be spiritual leaders. I've heard John Corson tell stories about how he encouraged the women to go and ask their own husbands about biblical stuff, and some of the women, well, my husband's not even a believer. Well, go ask him anyway. Then all of a sudden, they get phone calls from a husband. I need you to help me answer this question because my wife's asking me. And you put this on. But the thing is when a lady, this will be my last point on this, and we'll go back to Genesis and kind of close up. But when a woman has a need for a man, all of a sudden boys start becoming men. When there's a need for a man to fix the problem, you will find men rise to the occasion. You see, I could care less that there's a bunch of tight jars in our kitchen cupboards until my poor, helpless little wife needs a big, strong man to get that jar open. And she knows. She knows if I open that jar, she better feel my arms when it's over. And it's like a big joke between us, but it's the funny thing is like, man, men want to be needed in the way of being useful. That is inside of us, and almost every man here, we're all a little different, but inside of a man is this desire to be needed, to be useful. And so this is the whole idea, is that when a woman chooses, even if she could probably get the jar open herself, sometimes I bet you she just gives it to me either way. Can you just open this? Because you're just so big and strong. I'm like, yes, I can. And I just go up and, and get the thing open, and I'm a hero. And it is when I need you to be the man. I need you to lead this house. Because without you, we're all lost. All of a sudden, you'll see boys stepping up and take that deep breath in, and they become the man they need to be. And so I think that's the advice given here. But Israel decided to become a man. He stepped up his game. He made choices to change his family, to make a difference for everyone else. And it's right there in the end where it says, verse 21, then Israel journeyed. It's not until he started leading his family, he started working through with his wife, that finally that name Israel is used of him. And I thought I was at my last point, but there's one last point. I'm pulling the pastor thing here. But here's the big thing too. It's never too late. I didn't want to forget that one. Whether it is to take a stand to be a woman of God or to be a man of God, it's never too late, because Jacob is approximately 100 to 105 years old when this is taking place, okay? That's pretty old. In fact, it's probably older than anyone here. I'm just going on a limb there. But here's the thing. His older kids got kind of messed up because they were raised under Jacob. And he can't go back. You can't turn back time and fix the problems from back then. Reuben, in the next verse, his oldest son, is going to sleep with one of his wives. His next two oldest sons, they're the ones that slayed the city. Judah is going to pull some wacky stuff in chapter 38, where he ends up sleeping with his stepdaughter, but it's okay because he thought she was a prostitute. Didn't know it was a stepdaughter, right? I mean, that's bad. Dinah gets raped. The next four oldest kids, the two from Zilpah and my brain just went a blank. Bilhah and Zilpah, their sons, we don't know what they did, but it was bad because Joseph had to report it to his dad. So, I mean, all the kids had some issues, but tonight, Sunday night, we're going to start getting into the territory of Joseph. In the Old Testament, there are very few people who actually have a little bit of text devoted to them where not a single bad thing is said about them. David had faults, right? Moses had faults. Noah had faults. Adam had faults. All these characters we know had faults. There is more of Genesis dedicated to Joseph than any other Bible character. And it's never negative. He is a godly young man. He faces the most crazy of temptations, and he always prevails. Joseph was the first son who got to live most of his childhood under Israel. And Israel was over 100 years old, and I think he was almost more of a grandfather figure than a father figure. Just looking at that big age difference. But Joseph was raised up, and when he went over to his dad, who was he was almost grandpa. So if you're a grandpa, same kind of thing. He respected his words, and this is how our family lives. This is what we do, Joseph. This is why we do it, Joseph. This is the God of Bethel. And he taught young Joseph. And Joseph spent the majority of his childhood being brought up under that godliness. And he goes to live one of the most successful campaigns as far as any believer in the entire Bible. And there's over 100 ways you can compare Joseph to Jesus. It's pretty miraculous. So it's never too late to make that stand that God's going to be the God of our house. And I'm going to step up and I'm going to do what it takes to be the kind of man or to be the kind of wife or woman. If you're not married and you're a man, it'd be sweet if you'd be like this before you get married. The girl will appreciate it. If you're an unmarried girl, be ready for a guy like this and be looking for a guy like this. But also be ready to be the wife who can help produce a man like this. God is looking for men. One last verse for us to close on. So I sought for a man among them who would make a wall and he would stand in the gap. This world needs protection, and enemies are going to come through. He's looking for some man who will make a wall, stand in the gap before me on behalf of the land, that I should not destroy it. Someone who will take a stand for God. But I found no one, is what he says in Ezekiel. I pray that that's not the case today. I pray that when God looks at our church, the people here, the men and the women, that God sees a whole bunch of people who decided to take a stand. It's God way or no way. Let's pray. Father, we thank you that you continue to talk to our hearts, you continue to talk to our souls, and you're always doing a great work in us. And Lord, I pray for all the men and the women here today, God, that we would stand firm on your word. We'd stand firm on the things which you have taught us.